My name is Tom Miller, and I'm one of the tour guides for Preservation Durham's cemetery tour team. And we're here in beautiful Maplewood Cemetery. It is at the end of April here, 2020. We were originally to have tours in Maplewood earlier this month, but we had to cancel them because of our coronavirus problems. And speaking of the coronavirus, I thought it would be interesting to make a little video of an earlier pandemic, the evidence of it, here in Maplewood. Just 102 years ago, in 1918, we had a terrible pandemic, worldwide pandemic with the Spanish flu. And so behind me you see one of the early expansions of Maplewood Cemetery, and we're going to stop for a moment while we walk over to the potter's field that was created in the early 1910s, where a number of Spanish flu victims are buried. Our videographer today is April Johnson, who is the executive director of Preservation Durham. So this is the grave of Elton Jernigan. Elton was born in 1894 and he died on December 7th, 1918. His death certificate in the county records shows that he died of the Spanish flu and indicates that he was sick only one day. The interesting thing about the Spanish flu is that it was, unlike most viral diseases, seemed to hit the young adults the hardest. People in the range of 20 to 40 suffered the most with Spanish flu, and Mr. Jernigan was no exception. He grew up in the West Durham Mill Village, served in the United States Army during the First World War, was hardly returned from that war when he went to work for the Durham Morning Herald as a pressman. He became ill on December 6th and died on December 7th in the still relatively new Watts Hospital. Just a little bit of information about the Spanish flu. It came in 3 waves in 1918 and 1919. The first wave was in the spring of 1918. It then subsided a little bit, and then in the fall of 1918 it roared back and killed millions of people worldwide. The estimates for deaths to Spanish flu run between 20 and 80 million. It is believed that somewhere between 1% and 6% of the world's population died as a result of the disease. Because it was a virus, there were no effective treatments, and in 1918 they did not even have ventilators. In the United States, between 500,000 and 800,000 people died, and for some perspective, at the time there were only 106 million people in the United States, unlike the 350 to 370 million people we have today. In North Carolina, the Spanish flu was not as bad as it was in other states. It was, of course, carried from person to person along railway lines, and North Carolina had an undeveloped railway industry, which was a bit of a blessing when this pandemic hit. It is estimated that in this state some 13,500 people died. Step over here, not far away from Mr. Jernigan, is the grave of Robert Wallace Daniel. He was about 18 months old when he passed away. Unlike Mr. Jernigan, who suffered only a day with the Spanish flu, the 18-month-old baby, Robert Wallace Daniel, struggled against the flu for 2 weeks before he succumbed. He also died in Watts Hospital and is buried here in the Potter's Field. And steps away from the graves of Mr. Jernigan and little Walter Daniel is the grave of Stamey Thompson. It's her granite stone here is covered with lichen, maybe a little difficult to see. You can see that she was born in 1891 and died in 1918. She was 27 years old when the flu took her away on October 20th, 1918. The most remarkable thing about this grave is it bears the seal of Watts Hospital. And it's difficult to make out here, but it's a circle with a cross in it, and it says "Heal the Sick, Watts Hospital, Heal the Sick." And this is a facsimile of the pin that Watts Hospital nurses get even today from the Watts School of Nursing. And her work colleagues bought this headstone for her and put it here. So she was a first responder, a care worker who was treating the sick in Watts Hospital at the very height of the Spanish flu pandemic back in 1918. This was right at the middle of the second wave of the disease when most of the people in the United States died of it. I did a little quick research in the death records in Durham County, and for the week before and the week after Miss Thompson died, nearly 50 people died of Spanish flu in Durham County. And at the time, although just for perspective, at the time Durham County had about 22,000 people in it. Of course, today we are approaching 300,000 people. So imagine a disease that is killing in late October 1918 as many as 2 or 3 people a day. It was big news, and it's very sad that a first responder, a caregiver like Stamey Thompson would pass away of the disease. So here in this potter's field is a little concentration of people who died of Spanish flu 102 years ago. There are more Spanish flu victims buried throughout Maplewood Cemetery. Of course, the flu was no discriminator. Poor people and rich people passed away of the disease. It was not very well understood, and their graves are scattered throughout the cemetery in kind of a ring around the oldest part of the cemetery. That's kind of the conclusion of our little video today on the Spanish flu while we're in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. I thought it would be interesting to consider what happened here in our county a century ago as it is recorded here in Maplewood Cemetery. This will be the first of, I hope, several videos that we'll bring to you highlighting Durham's history for Preservation Durham. At Preservation Durham, we have almost 50 years of experience ourselves in trying to save the best part of Durham's history and to keep the Durham story alive. Hope you'll join us at Preservation Durham. You can visit our website at www.preservationdurham.org, or do what I do, just Google Preservation Durham. And online there you'll see a donate button, but we would really like to have you as a member. Hit the join button and become a member of Preservation Durham. When the coronavirus restrictions are lifted and it's safe for us to be out and to gather together again, we will resume our tours in Durham, especially our tours of Maplewood Cemetery, and very soon we hope to bring you an excellent tour of Beechwood Cemetery on the other side of town. And I want to thank you for your time today. Interestingly enough, this section of the cemetery where this potter's field is part of a larger section of the cemetery that at one time was leased to the Fitzgerald family. The Fitzgeralds came to Durham as brickmakers at the end of the Civil War. This section ultimately was taken back over by the city and used to expand Maplewood Cemetery. We're in the potter's field section of the cemetery, and let me explain that a little bit. Every time the cemetery expanded, a section was set aside for people who died without any money or who died on the county and became the Durham County's responsibility to bury. And so the cemetery always laid a section aside of inexpensive graves, single graves, for poor people and for people who the county had the expense of burying. and we're in one of those sections now. This section was laid out in about 1910, and for 10 years this was Maplewood Cemetery's Potter's Field. There are several other sections like this throughout the cemetery. But you can see originally, and I'll turn and point out, before the cemetery was graded at the turn of the last century, this was a gully that came up from the woods, and the Potter's Field was created by filling in this area, and you can still see kind of the swale that's created there. There are not very many headstones in this section of the cemetery. Although it is completely full, every gravesite is filled. There are just a few headstones when family members could pull together the money that required to mark their loved ones' graves. But the Potter's Field sections were filled in sequentially. You didn't come out and select a gravesite. Starting at the high end up here in around 1910, the graves were filled in one by one until it was finished in the early 20s down at the bottom down there, which means that during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, there is a cluster of graves of Spanish flu victims down at the bottom. We'll go down and talk about a couple of those. Before we do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about where the term Potter's Field comes from. It's a biblical expression. In the book of Matthew, those of you who are up on your Bible will recall that after Judas betrayed Christ, he was given 30 pieces of silver, and because he felt guilty about it, he tried to get rid of the money by giving it to the temple. And the officials at the temple would not take the money, saying that it was blood money. But instead, they used the money to buy a piece of barren ground outside the walls of Jerusalem to bury poor people. And we've used that expression ever since. It's called the Potter's Field, is because that poor piece of ground was essentially clay, and it is where the local potters went to dig clay to make pots with. And we still have that expression around today. Thank you for joining us here with this video. It's the first of many, and I hope you'll join Preservation Durham.